John Keefe here in his 7th decade reporting on Liverpool Football Club. He's written over a dozen books about the Reds. He won the trust of Bill Shankly, Bob Paisley, interviewed Paisley after the Reds' European Cup successes in Rome, and even held the European Cup for Kenny Dalglish at Wembley in '78. Thank you for sitting down with us today and hopefully sharing a few interesting stories.
Great pleasure. It's nice to be back in the Shankly Hotel where we're doing this, because before it opened I actually was asked to do some stories about Bill, recorded, so that people when they checked into the rooms could just press a button and hear Shankly stories. So there you are.
Absolutely fascinating they are as well. We're going to come to them, but if you was here today there was a dinner party and there was 3 people from Liverpool history, who would you invite?
Well, Bill Shankly. 3's not enough, Matt. I'd have 4. I'd have Shankly, Bob Paisley, Ian Callaghan and Kenny Dalglish.
And any reason particular why you include Callie in that?
Yeah, because he's my oldest friend in football. I've known him more than 50 years, probably about 55 years. He was the first book I ever did, the Ian Callaghan story. I've done 3 books with Ian, but that was the first ever book I wrote. And he's just a lovely guy, and he sort of represents Liverpool. He's a great ambassador. And of all the accolades he's got, and he's got many, the greatest I can give him, he's got so much humility and modesty for all he's achieved in the game. And Kenny speaks for itself. I was very friendly with Kenny. I am very friendly with Kenny. Did his column for the Daily Express for 2 years, which wasn't easy because Kenny wasn't given to controversy. And I had to make the column sing a bit and be of interest, and that challenged me a lot. But as you mentioned in the intro, one of the great memories was in 1978 at the European Cup final against Bruges. The office wanted a quick column from Kenny right after the game, so they get the early editions. But the problem was the day before the game I got laryngitis. So I croaked to Kenny, "I got a problem, can't." He says, "No problem." He says, "When we win the European Cup, you make sure you're on the running track. I'll give it to you and you can take it to the dressing room." Couldn't believe this. Sure enough, I got down and he just gave it to me, and I carried it down from the pitch to the dressing room. But Kenny had already told Bob I was going to come in, and I didn't have to ask a question. He just spoke to me, and I raced back up to the press box, which was then hanging off the roof at Wembley, and a colleague of mine, Derek Potter, was waiting with an open line to the copy takers in London, long before computers and mobile phones, and I croaked the stuff in his ear and he dictated it to the copy taker, and we had our column in the early editions. So one of the great stories of my career, that.
It's a shame there wasn't camera phones around in that time to capture that moment, right?
Exactly, exactly, absolutely.
So your career, Merseyside sport, not just Liverpool, but especially Liverpool that we're here to talk about today, the Reds. But one of the stories I wanted to speak to you about was the time when Liverpool first wore all red.
Yes.
Tell us about that. Was there any, you were very friendly with Bill, or you got to know Bill very well. What was the backstory?
Well, the backstory to that was that Bill went to see Manchester United play Real Madrid at Old Trafford, and he thought that all white, he said, makes them look bigger, more powerful. And it's always in his mind after that to make Liverpool all red. And so they had the game against Anderlecht in November 1964. And a few days before, I think it's possibly the day before, after training, he goes to big Ron Yates and says, "Son, come here, put this red strip on." And Ron said, he says, "No, and now walk across the field." And Ron did this, and he says, "Jesus Christ, you look 7 feet tall." He said, "I'm only 6'2". "It's near enough 7 feet for me, son." And the next day, of course, the next night, they played all red. And Shankly came out with this immortal quote. He said, "When I came to Anfield and they ran, it was like a fire was burning. And I went home to Jessie, and went home to Nessie," that Jessie was Bob's wife. "I went home to Nessie and I said, there was a fire, there's a glow at Anfield like a fire was burning." And she said, "Okay, just have your cup of tea and go to bed." But he was full of it. He was absolutely full of it. And of course, what a wonderful masterstroke. Players look bigger when they're in the same colour strip. So, yeah, that was another great Shanks innovation, Matt.
Interestingly then, was Liverpool known as the Reds prior to that?
They were locally, yes, locally they were known as the Reds, but of course there's a great confusion with Manchester United. Their official name is the Red Devils, not the Reds. And I hate people saying United are the Reds. No, they're the Red Devils. Liverpool are the Reds. It was often called the Pool, actually, the Pool. And then prior to that, it was known as Liverpool, with the great Billy Liddell. I knew him as well. I did a book about Billy, and he was a fantastic player. To me, he's the finest Liverpool player I've ever seen, simply because he was in a mediocre team, and that's being complimentary to them. But he shone, and his goals one season stopped them going into the third division. Goodness knows where they'd have ended up. He scored 30 league goals one season to help keep them up, but he was a wonderful, wonderful player. And the amazing thing about Billy was he only trained twice a week. He was an accountant, and that was his job. He only trained twice a week, and yet he was so brilliant. He was one of only 2 players to play for the Great Britain team twice, he and Tom Finney. Just incredible.
For the younger generation, which is probably most people that are watching and listening to this, tell us a little bit more about Billy Liddell and that era of Liverpool Football Club. What positions did he play, and what role did he have in making Liverpool into not a team in the third tier?
Well, he was signed before the war from a wonderfully named Scottish club called Lochgelly Violet. Lovely name. And because he made his impression after the war and helped Liverpool win the league title in 46-47. Bob Paisley made his debut that season as well. But Billy could play anywhere. He could play right across the line, on the wing, in the middle. In fact, he would often end up as a half-back or even as a full-back in emergencies. There was one game at Derby County when the goalkeeper, I think it was Tommy Younger, it was either Tommy Younger or Bert Slater, got injured, and they had to, he tossed up with Ronnie Moran, who'd go in goal, because there were no substitutes. And Billy won the toss, but they wouldn't let him go in goal. He was too valuable outfield. So Ronnie Moran went in goal, even though Ronnie had won the toss, as it were, not to go in. But Billy was just a sensational player. Ian Callaghan will tell you that he became a Liverpool fan because of Billy Liddell, because Ian's father was an Everton fan, and Ian went to see both teams. But he said when Billy got the ball, there was a whoosh went round Anfield, expectancy, and just incredible atmosphere when he got the ball. He was just wonderful, and he had a shot like a cannonball. He broke one goalkeeper's wrist trying to save one of his penalties. And then, of course, there was the famous goal that wasn't when they played Manchester City in an FA Cup replay, when Billy scored past Bert Troutman, but the whistle had gone between the ball leaving Billy's boot and going into the net, so it was disallowed. The crowd wouldn't go home. They thought it was, they had to appeal for the crowd to go home. Wonderful memories. I was a schoolboy then, by the way.
Different times, to say the least. We spoke about Liverpool becoming the All Reds and traditions that came into the football club. That, Bill introduced quite a few of them. The This Is Anfield sign, what do you remember about what Bill's role in that being installed? Obviously, the original idea behind it was not for it to actually say This Is Anfield.
The original idea was what, sorry?
Welcome to Anfield.
Oh, yeah, there was a welcome, but what happened was, and I've spoken to Ian Callaghan about this because I wanted to make sure my memory coincided with his, and I spoke to him only a couple of days ago. At that time, the teams came out together. They didn't come out singing, they came out side by side. And there is a story, which is uncorroborated, but I think it's true, that as they were going out for one match, one of the opposition players said, "It's only Anfield, all this stuff about it." And one of the players heard this, and this got back to Bill. So Bill says, "Right, we'll have a new sign saying This Is Anfield," so that it spooks them. And at the same time, an interesting thing, the Liverpool dressing room was soundproofed, so they weren't affected by the crowd noise, but the visitors' dressing room wasn't. Shanks wanted them to hear the build-up, the crowd noises, so that it was all part of the pre-match pre-match little idiosyncrasies Bill thought would affect the opposition team. And of course, when you look at results, he wasn't wrong on that either. So that's the story of This Is Anfield. The original This Is Anfield is now in the Liverpool Museum, obviously because the ground's been much redeveloped since then. But that was the story, apparently, yes.
I believe that the non-soundproofing of the away team dressing room is something that continued right up until the main stand was actually redone in 2016.
Yes.
Speaking of traditions then, Anfield has quite a lot of unique traditions, one of them being the applauding of the opposition goalkeeper, normally at the start of the second half when teams get turned around. Do you remember when that first happened and why it maybe was?
Well, it was certainly evident in the 1960s. My memory doesn't go back a long before that, although I went as a kid occasionally, but I've always remembered them applauding opposition goalkeepers. The thing is, Liverpool were brought up on goalkeepers. Their telegraphic address used to be Goalkeeper Anfield, because they had great goalkeepers, Sam Hardy, Elisha Scott, Cyril Sidlow, Wales International, and all the way through. They've had notable goalkeepers, some quite brilliant goalkeepers. And I think it was in the blood of Liverpool fans to think of goalkeepers as something special. And I think that's why it developed. And then, of course, later on, after England had won the World Cup, Gordon Banks came and he got special applause. But I think that was because he'd helped England win the World Cup. But certainly, as far as my memory goes, they've always respected goalkeepers, always.
Is that something that Bill or Bob or anybody ever discussed with you, in that it's something that they liked about the Kop, that they appreciated the opposition? Because beyond the applauding of the goalkeeper as just a normal match day, the Kop has applauded opposing teams off many times in its history.
Yes.
Under Shankly through to under Jurgen.
That's right.
I've as an individual, Ronaldo even got it more recently, but when teams such as Rafa Benitez's Valencia side played Liverpool off the park and Liverpool applauded them, and the same with the likes of Blackpool and teams like that. Is that something that you've witnessed over the years or ever encountered?
Well, yes. I mean, it has been a hallmark of the Liverpool crowd. Bob Paisley, Bob had, talking about the Anfield crowd, he said, well, what they like is action, blood and movement, which is lovely. But they also like finesse. They've been brought up, of course, in the last, 60 years on very nice football. So they do appreciate it when the opposition play like that. Likewise, if they don't, they're very quick to boo if the players are stringing 10 men across the back. But I think they've always been aficionados of good football. And certainly Shankly and Paisley were aware of that and would often make, comments aside about because Bob always said the first thing you have to do when you go away from home is to quieten the crowd. And that's what he was always aware of with his own team, to stop the opposition playing as well, so the Kop would start applauding them rather than their own team. So yes, it was very much in the minds of the managers, I'm sure, and it was passed down, I'm sure Jurgen Klopp feels the same today.
Bill Shankly was the ultimate orator. But one of his most famous speeches and quotes that I absolutely love is when he told the fans, "I've told the players they are privileged to play for you. I won't try and mimic Shankly in the way that you can." But was you there on that day when he gave that speech in front of thousands of fans after the FA Cup final?
Yes, at St George's Hall. I was indeed, yeah. He was... there's a funny story about that, because in the course of that speech, he wanted to refer to Chairman Mao, because we're all together, and he couldn't remember the guy's name. Now, Brian Hall, a very clever guy, university graduate, he was standing almost next to Shanks. He said, "What's the name of that?" And he said, "You mean Chairman Mao?" "Yes, Chairman Mao said all the people must work together, and that's what you and I do." And honestly, Peter Robinson was standing behind, and Peter said to me a few days later, if Bill Shankly had told that crowd to storm through the Mersey Tunnel and seize Birkenhead, they'd have done it. It was ultimate power over people. He did have that. Either en masse or even individually, when you spoke to him, he had an aura, he was cloaked in this charisma, and he had a stance as well. He was magnetic. He was a magnetic personality.
That iconic photo of him on the steps in front of the adoring fans, you know, they say that there's many other Shankly quotes that we can all, well, probably yourself can recite much better than I ever could, when he talks about it being a religion. This is their religion, this is where they come.
That's right, yeah. Bastion of invincibility was another of his great... Yes, he was... But the thing about Bill was he would rehearse his lines and his gags every day, going from Anfield to Melwood for the training, as they did. He used to have Joe Fagan, Bob, Ronnie Moran in the car, and he'd rehearse some lines, some funny lines mostly, and if they laughed, he'd deliver them to the media later. If they didn't, he'd come up with something else. That's what he did. He, like in best comic tradition, he rehearsed his ad-libs, which is wonderful, you know, which is great. And he had a line every day. Every day he went to a press conference with Bill, he had a line. And he didn't have to come out saying, I wonder what the line is today, because he would provide it, you know. It was amazing. And the other thing about Merseyside football, Liverpool and Everton, is that press conferences began in this city. There were no pre-match press conferences. What happened used to be that the two clubs would ring Don Kendall. Now, Don Kendall was the press association man on Merseyside, and they would ring him with the teams and he would give them out to the media. That was it. That was all there was. So we approached the two managers, Harry Catterick and Bill Shankly, to say, could we see you the day before games to talk about the squad, any injuries, what he thought about the game? And they were, well, particularly Shanks was very for it. Harry didn't like the media. He was very secretive, and that was not as successful as it should have been. But with Bill, it was superb, and it carried on right through, you know. Poor old Bob wasn't, he was thrown into it. I mean, he'd lived a life in football before he became manager, and he'd not dealt with the press. So he was very uncomfortable dealing with that. So he actually said to us one day, he said there was about four or five national press guys. And he said, I'm not used to this, so if you sort of sorted these things out for me and finished me sentences, like, could you do that? And we had this wonderful understanding with him. And then he said, but you can give it out to the rest. That's what we had to do, you know, because he just felt uncomfortable. And that lasted all his 9 years as manager.
Speaking about Bill, and people say that Jurgen is the modern day version of Bill Shankly, you're perhaps better placed than most people to be able to comment on that claim. Well,
there is a similarity in the sense that he's successful and he's got the crowd behind him, because the crowd love him, and he goes out and does his antics at the end of matches. They love it. That's what Liverpool's all about. So in that sense, he's like Shanks. But the thing about Bill was he was a natural comic. He was a comedian. He could have been a comedian. He had wonderful comic timing. And don't forget, he had more press conference time than Jurgen gets now. And he was closer to the media than Jurgen is. The whole game has changed. The relationship between the media and managers is utterly different than it was even 20 years ago, certainly in Shanks's day. So in that sense, it's very different. But yeah, as a leader of the fans, then Jurgen would be very like Bill. Certainly, but then you have to say so was Kenny, when Kenny was manager. But certain managers haven't been like that. We can name over the last 20 years or so. But yes, Jurgen would be, and Kenny certainly.
Understanding the culture of Liverpool as a football club, the city, its people, its social responsibility, and Jurgen buys into that, and he's not afraid to speak his mind, even if it goes against the sort of narrative of the rest of the country.
Yes, exactly, absolutely. And it's interesting that whenever Hillsborough's mentioned, Jurgen's very quick to get in and say, you know, that we've got to utterly respect what everyone went through. He gets that, absolutely. Yes, you're right.
I've spoke about what my favourite Bill Shankly quote is. Is there any particular quote that is your personal favourite of the hundreds and thousands that you must have on records?
Well, a funny one. We because what we used to do, Matt, at the end of matches, we'd all assemble in the dressing room corridor. That's where the after-match press conferences were, and we'd get the players catch cam from both sides, and the two managers. And Shanks would always appear in his Elliot Ness Mac. He loved the American Chicago gangsters type stuff, and he'd stand there saying, "Yes, boys," you know. And he was talking away one day, and one of the stewards shouted down, "Hey, boss, United and City have both lost. They're bottom and next to bottom." And he came and he said, "I'll tell you something, they'll take some shifting." Now, I think he knew, and he asked the steward to shout that so he would respond, because he would set these things up, you know. That was one of the lovely ones. Yeah, and also at the press conference when he resigned, you know, he said, "I get guided by my conscience, and my conscience tells me it's time to go." And I thought, And he did regret it, of course, within weeks, I think.
You've just literally predicted my next question. I was going to ask about the day that Shankly resigned. We've all seen the video of fans being completely perplexed by the news. Was you as surprised as the regular fan on the street?
Utterly shocked. July the 12th, 1974, 12 noon, in the trophy room at Anfield. We thought it was a signing. And in fact, there was a signing later, which got about 3 inches in the papers next day. It was a record signing. Ray Kennedy was signed, but the chairman signed him. But that's another story. So yes, we came into the trophy room, and the assembled media didn't know what was going to happen. In came Shanks, John Smith, the chairman, Peter Robinson, secretary, as he was then. And I can still see John Smith saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Shankly has intimated to us that he wishes to tender his resignation as manager." Now, we're in a room of hard-bitten media people, and there was an audible gasp went up. It was unbelievable. And Shanks looked quite uncomfortable. And then there was the end of the statement from John Smith, and he took questions, you know, not for very long. And yes, but you could see he thought he'd taken the right decision, but I think underneath, even then, he was regretting it. And when there was sort of dispersed, he came to myself and Colin Wood of the Daily Mail, and he said, "Who have they signed today?" And he didn't know. I said, "Well, they've signed Ray Kennedy." "Have they?" "Right, yes. Now, Ray Kennedy often goes in the books as Shankly's last signing. He wasn't. He knew nothing about it. It was just unbelievable. Of course, everything went mad. London were on, "Can you write this? Can you do that?" And then, as you say, the Vox Pop film interviews on the streets, people didn't believe it. Even Harold Wilson, the Prime Minister, made a comment about it. It was, because he knew Bill, it was unbelievable. It's certainly the most seismic event, taking away the tragedies, I've ever known in Liverpool history. I still can't get over it, really, in many ways, you know. I mean, Kenny's was a big one as well. I did have a slight inkling about Kenny, nothing I could write about, but I just had a feeling, and something he'd said to me which I couldn't corroborate, and that was a big shock, of course. But Bill Shankly resigning, and of course, he used to give Anfield as his home address on East European immigration forms when the club were going into communist Eastern Europe. Home address Anfield, you know, and he was walking away from it. It was staggering. I don't think there have been many bigger shocks in football post-war than that. Incredible.
And in came the humble genius himself, Bob Paisley. Not a job that he actually wanted to take on. And I've got a quote here from yourself. "I believe that nobody could have ignited Liverpool's fire like Shankly, and nobody could have fueled it like when Paisley became manager."
Yes, that's what I said.
Tell us a little bit about Bob then and what he did. He obviously was a very different character to Bill. So, you know, to take them then to win back-to-back European Cups and 19 trophies in 9 seasons.
Yeah, well, as you say, utterly different personalities. Totally, utterly different. Shanks, the great extrovert. Bob, the great introvert. Bob used to say about him, Bill wears steel tips on his shoes, so you can hear him coming. Me, I like me carpet slippers. And that really summed them up. And he'd never dealt with the media. He didn't want the job. Peter Robertson and John Smith were utter distraction that he couldn't get him to take the job. Peter said, we went down on bended knee several times, and eventually he said to them, I'll take the job till you get a proper manager. That's what he told them. And that's what he told the players the first time he saw them as manager. I'm only here till you get a proper manager. Emlyn Hughes told me this. It's some proper manager, 19 trophies in 9 seasons, isn't it, you know? But the thing about Bob and Bill, they dovetailed wonderfully. And I think possibly Shanks made many great decisions, but I think his greatest decision was his very first one, to keep the staff he inherited. He didn't bring anybody with him, and he had Bob and Joe Fagan already there, and he said, together we'll create a bastion of invincibility, and he had this faith in that. I thought that was fantastic. And in doing that, he really created a dynasty, because they followed the boot room, you know, managers came out of the boot room for years and years after. But with Bob, his knowledge of football was unbelievable. Tommy Smith, for a short time after finishing playing, was on the backroom staff. And he used to accompany Bob to matches, especially looking at the opposition. And Tommy Smith used to say, I can't believe this man. He said, he'll sit and watch him at half time, he'll give me the strengths and weaknesses of every opposition player. He said, it's incredible. He said, if you can tune into his accent and what he's saying, you know, like the number 3, it's a good long one and stuff like this. But he was uncanny, Bob. And he did have this sort of, how can I put it, this ice-cool brain. I remember Liverpool were involved in a semi-final replay against Arsenal, and David Johnson got concussion, and Tommy Smith was then on the backroom staff, and he was sort of on the, and Bob rushed, he said, what's the matter? He's got a bang on his head. He said, right, I want him to go and play wide right, but don't tell him, because if he's concussed, he won't know where to go, and we bring him off. If he's all right, he'll know where to go. Now, in the heat of battle, sheer genius that. You don't tell him to play, say, go on the pitch and play wide right, but don't point out. And if he knows where wide right is, we're okay. But, you know, just little things like this. And also, the other thing too, which people might find amazing, he would often apply racing terminology and racing knowledge to footballers, because he used to go to his friend Frankie Carr up at Malton in the summer to watch the horses in the, you know, on the stables and runs and things, and he'd come back and he'd say, yeah, well, there's an horse there like Davy Fairclough, likes the sun on his back, run all day like, and then you've got the guy who'll go through the mud, well, that's the Ray Kennedy fella. And he also came up with a lovely line one day. He'd signed somebody. He said, yeah, well, he'll just fit in with us. I forget which player it was. He said, because you see, when they're sending the horses to the races, they don't put 2 thoroughbreds together. No. They have a thoroughbred and they put a donkey in with him. And that's what they do. You've got to have your flair players, and you've got to have the fetchers and carriers. Another one, he said, sort of, if you go into the station, I'll carry your bags. I mean, lovely phrases, these, you know. But he was steeped in the game. He was the most knowledgeable man on football I have ever met. He was unbelievable.
And obviously he brought Liverpool their first European Cup, cups, multiple. The 1977, the first European Cup success. Yeah. You travelled with the team.
I did,
What was that like? And tell us about the experience both beforehand. You know, that this seemed very like it was almost fate to win that European Cup, and then afterwards, what was the mood and the party like? Obviously, Bob celebrated in his own way with his slippers and his cardigan still.
Yeah, well, I travelled with them right through the season. in Europe. It was sensational. It really was. I think there was a feeling that going out to Rome, that although it was a tough Borussia Mönchengladbach were a, formidable opposition, I just had a feeling Liverpool would win it. They were good enough to win it. Bob had them primed, and quite remarkable kind of team tour, but they were full of it. Phil Neal said, yeah, it really buoyed me up, hearing Bob say that, the boss was saying that. And of course they played ever so well. There was a slight setback when Mönchengladbach scored, but yeah, and then in the second half, they really proved that they were the best team in Europe. Kevin Keegan's farewell. He led Bertie Vogt's a merry dance, and eventually Bertie paid the price, and they were close friends as well. And then Tommy Smith, Roy of the Rovers, you couldn't script his goal, a rare header. Bob Paisley said, even Dixie Dean would have liked his header. I don't know when his last one was. Lovely stuff. After the game, it was just sensational, because we went back to the Holiday Inn St. Peter's we were staying, and it was just a riot. It was an absolute riot. There were people pouring champagne out of windows, throwing people in the swimming pool, and there, sitting in a seat on his own, was Bob in his cardigan drinking orange juice. And he said, I'm going to savour every minute. There's only two people in Rome alongside me sober tonight, the Pope and Horace Yates. Now, Horace Yates was the teetotaler sports editor of the Liverpool Daily Post, getting on in years at the time. And so there was Bob sitting drinking orange juice in this moment of high triumph. It was sensational. It really was. And I thought, I'm privileged to be here, and a turning point for Kevin Keegan. Amazing.
Did you partake in a little bit of champagne celebration?
I think I had a glass or two, Matt, Yes, I certainly did.
Fantastic.
Yes.
Got to, right. This story that you tell there about the 77 and then 78, that's part of your new podcast series, Merseyside Legends. Tell us a little bit about that, and obviously so far we've had Bill Shankly and Bob Paisley. What else is there to come?
Yes, thank you for mentioning it. It's called Merseyside Legends with John Keith, and it's available on Apple or Spotify or Google. Just Google the title. It came about because I've got so many interviews, heritage archive interviews of Merseyside legends. And a friend of mine called Ollie Cowan, much younger than me, but a whiz kid in audio and computers, and he said, John, what is this doing in cupboards and drawers? It should be out there. I said, yeah, but they're on old cassette tapes. No problem. I'll enhance those. The job he's done is unbelievable. So we've got, We've done Bill Shankly, Dixie Dean, Bob Paisley. The last one out is Howard Kendall, and we've got others to come. We've got so many more to come. Kenny's going to be done. I've got also, just slightly changing the pace, also got Ken Dodd. I've got 80 minutes of Ken Dodd. I knew Ken very well as well. So we've got him. So yeah, we've got a lot to come yet. Kevin Sheedy too.
I have to say that they're very unique and they're superbly produced, so credit to your...
Well, that's very kind of you, Matt. It's nothing to do with me. That's down to Ollie Cowan.
It's fascinating to hear the way that they're all pieced together around the game, and it's not just Bill speaking or Bob speaking.
Well, that again is down to Ollie, because I've run through the script and I've marked where the audio should go, but he's done it. He's the jigsaw man. Wonderful.
So how many hours of recordings must you have on your distinguished career of over...
Matt, it's got to be hundreds, but I wouldn't know, to be honest. I know I've got about 500 tapes, most of them cassettes, a few CDs, but mostly cassettes. It must be 500 or more, so if they're an hour long, I'm guessing it might be more than that, I don't know.
Just tell us about bring us up to speed modern day. What is your role on who do you work for on a match day at Anfield now?
Yes, I work for RTE, the Irish National Radio and Television Service. I've worked for them now since 1997, and I cover Everton and Liverpool home games for them. And I've rarely enjoyed myself as much in working since the early 60s than I do now, because, you know, they use these strange words, Matt, like please and thank you. And they're lovely people to work for, absolutely fantastic. And I enjoy it immensely. Yeah, it's brought me a whole new chapter in the media, really, because when I left the Daily Express in 1996, I covered Euro 96 for them. I left the Express after 30 years, and then I immediately started doing radio. I worked for Radio Merseyside doing the sports bulletins for a while. Then I went to radio. I did the football phone-in for Merseyside for 10 years, live from both grounds. And then I went to Radio City. I did 10 years of doing strictly John Keith, interviews with sports, showbiz people, and then I worked for RTE. Sometimes they coincided, actually, but I left Radio City, and then the last, since 97, been working for RTE. So been many and varied. Of my, you know, started on the Bootle Times in 1963 when I first met Shanks, in awe of him, of course. See him standing in the corridor now and in his Mac, and there's me, a raw 18-year-old, you know.
60 years, you know, covering Liverpool Football Club, that's what it is for you then this year. What's it like now watching Jurgen's team arguably play the best football maybe during that 60 years? Was that too big of a claim at times? And yet only one league title to show.
Yeah.
You know, do you think that it's much harder to win the title now? Or is that not really a fair claim?
It's certainly hard. I wouldn't say it's harder. I mean, now money has now changed the league, the Premier League, to the extent that, you know, really one of 4 or 5 teams are going to win the championship, going to win the title. Back in the 60s, no, the competition was intense. Any team could win the title, almost. So I don't think you could say it's harder now. I would say it may be as hard, but I wouldn't take away the difficulty it was in Shanks and Bob's time, not at all, no, absolutely not. Some of the best football I've seen played by Liverpool was under Bob Paisley. Some wonderful stuff. The teams he created were just magic. Jurgen Klopp too has created some wonderful sides, but I've been so fortunate to watch them all the way through. I often, when I see something happen, I ultimately say, I wonder what Bob or Bill Shanks would have done, or how they would have reacted. Sometimes for the good, sometimes for the bad, you know. I never tire of making comparisons, which is silly, because you can't compare. Comparisons are odious, really. They're of their time, aren't they?
So, final question then to wrap up. You're 60 years following reporting on Liverpool. If you could go back and rewatch any game, just watching it from the stands as a supporter and enjoying it, which one game would you choose and why?
Well, I think it would have to be Liverpool in Rome in 1977. I did this as the match of my life for Radio City. It's got to be that, because it was an epoch. It was Liverpool had reached what they were striving for years, to be champions of Europe. It was a page being turned in history and setting the tone for the future, and it's got to be that. And especially as Bill Shankly was there to witness it as well. He was in the stand. He was there as Liverpool's guest. And Bob, after the manager who didn't want the job, winning the first of 3 European Cups, absolutely amazing. Keegan's farewell. There were so many fairy stories about that game. Bob going back to Rome for the first time. You couldn't script any of it. So it would have to be that, Matt, I think.
John, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for taking the time to speak with us today.
Pleasure for me, Matt. Thank you.
We've spoken for hours and hours, and maybe we'll do this again and get some.
No problem. Thank you, Matt.
Such an illustrious career that you've had yourself. So thank you for giving us all those years as well.
Thank you very much.